Hi everybody. Let me know if this isn't working, but I'm pretty sure it's all right. So thank you all for spending the Monday night with me, talking about moths in our cities and towns and how to conserve them. So I've basically been working on moths from my undergraduate through my PhD and now and continuing even now. So just a little bit about me. So I'm an ecologist fascinated by moths, and this started off during my undergraduate degree in zoology in the University College Dublin. And I kind of decided that I wanted to look at moths in gardens because I've always loved butterflies, and I got introduced to moth trapping at some stage and kind of during my undergraduate degree. And then I did my project on urban moths and how does gardening practices influence moth communities. And I've run various workshops and public outreach, as you can see here, with just me holding lots of moths. And then I continued my work and went out to the University of Sheffield and I did my PhD and I finished it, nearly a year and a half ago now. And my PhD was all about understanding how moths, hoverflies, and bees survive in cities. And I spent 4 years in allotments, basically creating wildflower patches, installing bee nests, moth trapping, identifying insects, trying to understand, basically just how they survive, and the comparative analysis of what different pollinator groups are more sensitive to urbanization, specifically the comparison of moths and then our diurnal pollinators, such as bees and hoverflies. So those two that research is what I'm going to be focusing on in this talk. But at the moment now, I've just started in the University of Helsinki, which is a bit different. And just to kind of understand that you can go from the applied urban systems, and now I'm looking at basically long-term data sets and trying to understand how moth communities are changing over the last 30 years of climate change throughout Finland, which is pretty interesting. But there's lots of mosquitoes in the boreal forest, as you can tell by my pretty unimpressed face in this picture. And now moth research and collecting moths, or not collecting moths, but researching moths, has taken me around the world. I've been to the Carpathian foothills in Romania, in the beautiful meadows there, monitoring butterflies and moths. I've been to Costa Rica about for 4 summers, monitoring the butterfly populations in fragmented tropical forests. And with me there with the white witch moth, which is one of the largest wingspans in the world at 30 centimeters. And I've conducted kind of field courses in Spain for a couple of years, where I try to show students how to basically sample and monitor these species. So the content of this talk is going to follow a pretty simple structure, beginning with a very general, what is a moth? And I'm aware now that a lot of you are probably more knowledgeable about moth ecology than I am, but I'm just going to make sure we're all on the same page with that one. And then understanding the importance of moths, why bother looking at moths? And then what we know and what my research has shown about how moths interact with urban environments, and more specifically, what we know about moths in gardens. So yeah, as I said, if you know all this, just let your mind wander and try and look at some nice pictures for a little while. So what is a moth? So moths are within the order of insects called Lepidoptera, which include both butterflies and moths. And this is quite cool because from the Greek, it's derived as lepi, as scaly, and optera as wings. So scaly wings. And if you've ever held a moth or a butterfly, you'll notice that there's dust left on your hands. And this dust is basically modified scales that are adapted or evolved to basically be more elusive to predators, where they can basically make themselves really bright and also just physically be able to escape spider webs and make themselves less easy to catch. And Lepidoptera are a really hyper-diverse group with over 180,000 species in the world, which I think accounts for some ridiculous, like I think 10% of all ecological descriptions of all species. But don't quote me on that. But I mean, it's massively diverse. And now what makes a moth and a butterfly is kind of their life cycles are all the same, with some sort of variation in their kind of larval stages. But it basically starts off as an egg laid on a plant of a specific type. And then once they hatch, they turn into larvae, which are then caterpillars feeding on plant material or other materials that they're adapted to, but largely plants. And then they turn into chrysalises and emerge as adults, and then basically repeat the system. Adults mate and reproduce with eggs. And what's cool about Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, is that they feed on plants mostly as larvae, and then they also, so they use plants as kind of like a tissue and that kind of stuff, but then they also, as adults, feed on nectar, so they're also pollinators. And this kind of dual relationship with their environment makes them a really good biological indicator, coupled with their quick kind of cycle. So they're doing this kind of cycle either once or twice a year, means that any change in the habitat, you can relate their community change to how degraded the habitats are. So they're super sensitive to habitat change, and therefore can be considered in this term as biological indicators. So a really fascinating group to study, just in terms of even looking at kind of ecological indicators. So the difference between butterfly and moths, there's not really any hard rules, because it's kind of got exceptions to each rule, but overall, in general, you can have 3 rules. And this is, number 1 is the antennae. So they're either clubbed or not clubbed. So butterflies have got clubbed antennae, and then moths don't have clubbed antennae. They're kind of more feather-like. And then better than my drawing is an actual picture. So you can see here on the left is a butterfly antennae, which is clearly clubbed. And then the moth antennae for a female are nice and narrow, but the males have got these really feather-like antennae. And this is basically for pheromone communication. So so in the dark, basically, females can produce these perfumes or scents, which are pheromones, and to attract males, and that's how they communicate. And then looking at their wing shapes, or the way they hold their wings, should I say, is basically a nice indicator of what's a difference between a butterfly and moth. The butterflies hold their wings back, usually, and then moths basically hold their wings kind of like a tent-like shape and cover their abdomens. But there's lots of exceptions to that one as well. And then basically the kind of fascinating part of it all is that moths are generally nocturnal. The majority of moths are nocturnal, and butterflies are primarily diurnal, flying in the daytime. And we've obviously got some nice iconic exceptions of this rule. So we've got the hummingbird hawk moth that you can find in your gardens on a sunny day if you're lucky, and you've got the cinnabar moth. But any time really that you walk through long grass or understory vegetation, you can disturb moths at any time, and they can take off. But they're mostly active at nighttime. Now, the diversity of moths, so the fact that they're nocturnal is probably the reason why they're so overlooked. And like, I'm sure you guys are all really into this kind of stuff, so you're like the exception in the general perception of moths. And this is basically because they're nocturnal and active at night, they're largely underestimated, but they have the highest diversity of all pollinators in the UK. So we think about how much media attention the honeybee has, which is one species, and then you look at butterflies even, and that's like 59 species of butterfly. And then when you consider moths, they've got over 2,500 species that have been recorded. And this is really interesting as well when you consider all this kind of biodiversity theory, where it's like if you've got more biodiversity, you've got a more stable ecosystem. And this basically means that the more species you have carrying out the same function, such as pollination, for example, the more likely they are to survive disturbance, because you've got multiple species fulfilling a role. So if one species goes extinct, that role of pollination is still being upheld. So in terms of kind of ecological and ecosystem functioning, the diversity of moths is really, really important. So the importance of moths in a bit more detail. So this is a nice micro moth chart by Tortrix. So as I said, they're an overlooked but vital to our ecosystems. I'm sure it's the wrong audience, but they're considered a dull kind of insect, a pest that generally eats your clothes and garden plants. But you can see from these pictures I've taken in allotments and gardens that they're anything but dull. And they carry out massive really important ecosystem functions. And this is also due throughout their whole life cycle. So as herbivores, they're a pest to the plants that we care about, as I can understand, but they're also vital for plant regulation. So if there was no herbivory of these caterpillars on plants, you could see unregulated growth of plants and total this kind of transformation of our natural habitats. Some larvae feed on decaying matter, which can basically increase the fertility of our soil and bring nutrients back into the soil by breaking down this plant material. And then they're a food source, a vital food source for lots of birds and bats. And like the classic example is a blue-tit chick needs about around 100 caterpillars every day. And considering there's about 5 chicks in a nest, that's a lot of caterpillars to get it to fledgling. So as an adult, okay, this is the bit where I'm really interested in, and what my research has been quite focused on, is as adults, they're generalist nectivores, so they're feeding on nectar, and they're therefore becoming more apparent that they're important pollinators. And as they feed on nectar, they basically inherently get pollen stuck on their tongues, and as they transport that to their next flower to visit, they can be efficient pollinators and cause a plant to be able to reproduce effectively. But the problem is, when you look at the insect pollination literature, we don't know that much about moths or nocturnal pollination. So bees dominate the literature, as you can see from the kind of 2/3 of the research distribution. And then you've got a little section with syrphids and other flies. And then moths, yes, yeah, so it's a small pool of research, but it's growing now as new kind of methods for monitoring nocturnal pollination at night emerge. And I'll be talking about that kind of further on. One of the biggest worries now is the bad news is that moths are declining like many other groups. I mean, there's definitely variation and decline. Some species are increasing, but overall, this recent report basically showed that Britain's larger moths are declining by over 1/3 over the last 50 years. You can see the abundance is decreasing by this red line from the 1970s up to 2020. And that means the threats to multiple ecosystem functions that I've mentioned. And these declines, like basically every other one, are human mediated. And this is through land use change, loss of habitats and disturbance and pollution. And these are basically driven by agricultural intensification and urbanization. So urbanization is kind of a hot new topic. Well, not that hot, but like, I mean, or that new, I mean, but as our kind of countries become more urban, everyone's moving from rural to cities. And there's this massive urban sprawl and urbanization. So things are really pressurized in urban systems. And it's therefore a vital time to understand how to protect moths, just as it's being done with conserving bees. So if we can come up with some sort of framework, we need to get the research and basically create these conservation schemes that can help save the bees and the moths. Yeah, so with that, we can look within urban environments, and just the kind of general threats to moths is what I'm going to talk about. And light pollution isn't something that I've actually specifically looked at, but it's probably the most studied influence, the most studied kind of urban driver of how moths are responding to urbanization. So as we know, moths are attracted to light, and then as cities have become more lit up with artificial light, you can see from this kind of space image of Europe and the rest of the world. This kind of causes moths to spend a great deal of time and energy getting attracted by artificial light, which suppresses their ability to feed, their ability to interact with their environment in a natural way, and reduces their overall kind of, survival rates, I'd say. But there is an opportunity of this. So light pollution, there's this kind of concept that cities can be an ecological sink. And this means that if you're a rural moth kind of wandering around the English countryside and you see London, you basically go into London and you're attracted to London because of the lights. But then once you get within this kind of attractant and you're in the city, there's not enough habitat that basically can support these populations that are being driven to these cities. And we can therefore really step in and transform our green spaces to not necessarily let this be the demise of moths being attracted into cities, but actually enable them to have enough habitat to function within cities. And you can see that this is happening throughout cities around the world with conservation interventions happening. And we can see this as within green spaces in cities. We're slowly seeing a conversion of flat lawns into areas for wildlife. So, but like cities are super complex though. So we've got like the green spaces are interwoven and they're sparse and they basically vary. So we can have loads of different types of green spaces. We've got parks, we've got cemeteries, we've got gardens, allotments, and road verges. And all of these have got different management strategies. But there's this huge kind of movement within like a bottom-up approach through homeowners and garden owners and allotmenters that are basically planting flower patches and trying to create nectar and pollen resources for pollinators. And this has basically been shown by Catherine in Newcastle, or Northumbria, should I say, that urban gardens and allotments have got the highest biodiversity of flowers compared to other green spaces. And to continue on from that is that it's also been shown that these flower densities have been shown to benefit bees and hoverflies with a corresponding high diversity in allotments and gardens. But we don't know about moths. Do they utilize these resources that we're planting for them? And when you go back to considering their life history and their life cycle, at the larval stage, they're dependent on non-floral resources. And as an adult, they're dependent on floral resources for the most part. Whereas you look on the right, and bees, for example, are dependent on pollen to complete all stages of their life cycle for the most part. I mean, there's exceptions in different species every so often, but like basically bees collect pollen and then they feed their young pollen, and the broods feed on the pollen and then emerge as adults after eating the pollen, whereas the caterpillars of moths basically rely on different plant material. And that's kind of interesting because then we can think, are moths responding in different ways to urban systems, and whether or not we can conserve them in the same way as we're trying to conserve bees and other diurnal pollinators. Now, the next kind of concept is, well, quite a simple one, but it's urbanization gradients. So within cities, as we go from the suburban areas, we can basically go towards the city center and we see a reduction in green spaces and a higher density of impervious surfaces, such as roads and buildings and light pollution, for example. So therefore, along an increasing urbanization, we see declines in resource availability. And these have actually been shown to be important for predicting bumblebees, for example. Bumblebees can be quite low in almost rural areas, and then they peak in the kind of suburban gardens, and then they go back down towards the city center. And that's kind of my first question is, how does increasing urbanization, and this is like at a landscape level, affect moth communities? So I'm going to talk about the first chapter of my PhD, and this is what I went out to do to answer this question. So I basically sampled moths in 8 allotments in each city, so in Leeds, Sheffield, and Leicester, so throughout the kind of middle of England. And I'm sure lots of you know this already, but to sample moths, you use a light trap sometimes. Well, mostly, you can do it different ways. But the concept of this is the light turns on, it's a UV black light, and then moths get attracted into the light, and there's a little box at the bottom. And then all the moths kind of in the morning are all nestled up in these egg cartons waiting for you to look at them in the morning. And so I set up these moth traps throughout the summer. I think it was in 2018. And I measured the diversity of moths in UK allotments. And allotments are basically, we know what allotments are, but they're these really highly diverse green spaces, but they're also surrounded by different landscapes. And these landscapes can be less urban, as you can see on the left. So you can see lots of green spaces. And then they can also be more urban. And so what I found after this year of research was that it was very clear that there was way higher diversity of moths in the less urban sites compared to the more urban sites. I mean, 1 in 5 species were lost as you got to your highest urban allotment site, which is really important because this basically shows that an allotment scale level, no matter how much floral resources you have, this kind of has to be an effort at a landscape scale. And so when you can look at the gray space or the impervious surface, you can look on the flip side of that. It's like, what green spaces are these moths utilizing? So I measured all the habitats using landscape mapping, and it basically showed that moths are relying, so they're basically increasing as tree density or tree canopy area increases, and also the amount of semi-natural habitat surrounding an allotment. And when you compare this as well to bees and hoverflies, which I did in these allotments as well, I showed that actually moths are utilizing trees more than any other habitat in the green spaces, but bees and hoverflies were only showing a positive response to semi-natural habitat, which basically indicates that moth communities may be depending on different habitats in green spaces compared to bees and hoverflies, which is vital to our understanding about how to conserve them. And it's kind of based on our hypothesis that because they've got different life cycles and for the fact that they've different behaviors, such as being nocturnal, they will probably have different needs in terms of what habitats they need to utilize. And so to go more into fine scale analysis, I'm going to talk about a study I did in Dublin within gardens, so less landscape now, but more kind of at a garden level. So my question was, what garden habitat do moths prefer? And this was in 2017 in Dublin, and I had 8 gardens spread throughout South Dublin. And 4 of the gardens were classified as simple gardens. So I'm looking at a habitat kind of structure here, not necessarily identifying which plants and resources. So 4 simple gardens were chosen, and this was mostly lawn and patios. And then 4 complex gardens were chosen, and this was basically kind of understory shrubs and trees, and providing, as I said again, but like complex habitat structure. So the first question within this was, can a single garden influence a moth community? And again, I collected moths using light traps to assess their communities throughout the summer. And it's quite important to do it throughout the summer because their communities change very rapidly every four weeks, basically. So I sampled them every 2 weeks. And to answer this question, can a single garden influence a moth community? I basically had 2 levels in which I classified the habitat. So you can see here, the first little white square is the garden. So that's the garden habitat, the individual garden. And then I just had this 30-meter radius around the garden, which just captures, I'd say, like the neighboring gardens in a circle. And I measured that habitat too to see if that can better explain the moth communities that we're seeing in gardens. And so first of all, I recorded over 130 species of moths in South Dublin gardens. I mean, could you imagine? Look at the amazing diversity of these moths. And like these are like floating around basically every city, and it's just totally cool. Anyway, so back to the results. So can a single garden influence the moth community? And my results kind of indicated no. So when you directly compared simple gardens and complex gardens individually at the little scale, there was no difference in the diversity of moths or their communities, which was like, oh no. But however, when you consider the neighboring gardens and include that in trying to describe the moth communities that you've got or you've found in these gardens, you can see in this example that this kind of crudely drawn orange bit, that's actually all understory, like brambles and shrubs and trees. So basically moths prefer complex habitat, but it's only if neighboring gardens can also provide complex habitat as well. So complex habitat in the neighboring gardens increased the diversity by 50%, which is amazing because it's not even that big of a scale. So there's definitely incentive for providing these kind of complex habitats. And furthermore, I'm going to go a little bit further and say that shrubs and trees were preferred over different habitat types, including flower patches. So this is kind of individual, like area of shrubs. And you can see in this graph that on the left, on the axis going up, on the y-axis, you've got moth species richness, and it increases as the area of shrubs increases in both the gardens and also the surrounding areas. And then conversely, we've got the opposite pattern when we look at the area of patios and lawns. So moth species richness decreases when you've got less habitat or less complex habitat. So I feel like I've kind of already driven this through, but the two take-home messages here are that garden management, that there should be garden management targeting moths, specifically woody vegetation, from what this study implies. And then also gardeners need to collaborate with their neighbors if they can to create larger habitats with suitable habitat. And then we go into more research, and we're back to my PhD again in allotments. And this is a paper I've published now, but I'm going to talk to you through it now. So what flowers are moths feeding on? And again, we compare their life cycles. And moths are nectivores primarily. I mean, some adults don't feed at all, but that's besides the point. And then bees are pollen collectors and feed on nectar as well. They also have different morphologies. So moths have got like a straw-like proboscis, where they suck up the nectar, and then bees have got these complex tongues and also all these modified hairs to collect pollen. So they've got different morphologies, different needs, so they're likely to visit different flowers. But this has never been done before. I mean, it's been done a little bit, but there's never been a comparison between bees and moths. What are they both feeding on? And the million-dollar question is, how do you observe nocturnal visitation? So to do this, you basically, as they're feeding on nectar, they end up having pollen on their proboscis, as I've said before. And if you take the pollen off their proboscis, you can basically use you can either identify the pollen with a microscope, and you can see here the nice electron microscope picture of all the different pollen morphologies, and you can identify them down to like genus or some species level, because each plant has got a different type of pollen or a pollen shape. But you can also do this way, where you can take the pollen off their proboscis and then extract the DNA from that pollen. And using small DNA barcodes, they're called, which is just like a sequence of the base pairs, you can identify the pollen based on their unique sequences, which is amazing. So that's what I did in my next research chapter of my PhD. What flowers do moths and bees visit in and around allotments was my research question. So to do this, I basically extracted the pollen off the proboscis or mouth parts of the moths and off the bees, or the kind of pollen baskets off the bees, and sequenced them using DNA barcoding. And then once you've got the kind of match between the insect and the plant communities in which they're visiting, you can start to create these networks. So a network is just kind of like an insect on the top node, it's called, and then you can have these lines that link them to the plants in which the pollen identifies to. So we can see what they're visiting. Now I'm going to show you a big network now. This is one of my results. So I'll talk you through this. I'll talk you through this. Just don't freak out. So moths and bees are on the top, and each node represents a species of moth or a bee, and yellow is bees and blue is, yellow is moths and blue is bees. And then at the bottom, you can basically see the plants that they're visiting and the links that attach them to those plants. And now the way these networks are basically generated, they group the different insect nodes, so the nodes at the top, with each other that are closest together. So this naturally came out when I analyzed it, that moths have got distinctive communities that they're visiting compared to bees based on their grouping at the top. And when you look at the plants down below, the percentages indicate the percentages of which plants in the community were visited by moths only, which was 37%. 17% were shared by both bees and moths, so both of them have the pollen of the plants on them. And then 45% of the plants were visited by bees only. And if you're curious about the big bars of insects, it means that there was more individuals. So the big bar of yellow is large yellow underwings, for example. So the kind of take-home message from that graph is moths visit a diversity of plants and have overlapping plant visitation, but they also have clear preferences of plants that they visit, which is really surprising because I just expected them to visit like one or two white flowers, basically, that bees didn't, that were open at nighttime. So when you break down these 37% of plants that moths visit by themselves, it was actually primarily woody plants again, including flowering shrubs and trees, which is like, I mean, just, it's not random because it's obviously a trend that I'm showing, but it seems that these shrubs and trees provide potential habitat or incidental pollen collection, but they could also just be really dependent on the nectar sources that they provide. And then bees were visiting annual plants, and barge and comfrey were the most frequently visited flowers. And this is driven by a lot of bumblebee and honeybee pollinators being the most abundant ones that I caught, basically. But the opportunities for conservation interventions basically lie in the overlap of the two groups. So this kind of inform whether or not we can create seed mixes that moths and bees could benefit from as adults. So moths visited garden plants, including incidental comfrey and barge, and also nasturtium, which is pretty nice. But this is also really cool. So both bees and moths were primarily visiting wild plants, despite being in the highly modified urban horticultural sites, including nice meadow plants and, well, and nice springtime plants like dandelions, and then we have clovers, forget-me-nots, and ragwort, which basically kind of implies to us that we've got this idea of what's been consistently brought up, is this allowing natural regeneration of wild species as an important step for urban bees, which has been shown, and now moths as well. So kind of less mowing, less enriched, and more kind of wild plants and natural regeneration. And also, which was kind of interesting, just an anecdote, was that nettle was one of the most identified pollen from moths and bees. And although it's wind pollinated, it could just be really in the atmosphere and getting blown around and attached to the insects. But it also kind of begs the question that are they important habitat for bees and moths? And definitely for butterflies and moth caterpillars, they're a good food source. So it would be cool to look further into that, but nettle patches are definitely have been shown to be really nice for a whole host of insects. And then, so we're just going to conclude here. So that's basically the quick rundown of 7 years worth of work. But we can see here that moths are important for our ecosystems by providing multiple functions through their life cycle and their massive diversity. and conserving them is pretty important, especially when you see the threats that they face in cities, such as urbanization and light pollution. And they face a lot of different kind of needs and requirements that we need to start targeting as well, compared to bees and other diurnal insects. So gardens and allotments and other green spaces we can definitely start to see that they have the potential to conserve their declining populations, but there needs to be like a bit more of a focused management beyond bee conservation. Well, especially from trees and shrubs, and increasing the complexity of habitats. And I think this is basically due to the fact that because they're nocturnal, they need to have a place to roost during the day as well. So you can imagine that this kind of complex, dense vegetation can be really important for their ability to survive throughout the day, just for example, but there needs to be so much more work done on this. Excuse me. And then finally, this kind of wild garden, I put it in inverted commas, but wild gardening and the regeneration of lawn weeds, or just nice flowers that have somehow been stunned against normal life. But yeah, this is a kind of classic. I think it's all pretty general advice that we can understand quite easily. But there needs to be a bit more kind of empirical evidence to see what gardening practices can basically influence moths in some sort of experimental way, I think, in my opinion. And then, yeah, gardening collaboration. So it's landscape level effects. We need like a neighborhood conservation approach. And I know it's well easier said than done, but it's just important to consider as well, and that one garden might not be enough in isolation. So just to kind of repeat myself, the last thing is that providing the requirements that moths need to survive in our cities is the key to conserving the amazing diversity of moths in your gardens. And I stole this from butterfly conservation, and these are just common garden moths and the diversity of them. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm definitely happy to take them, or any opinions. And then you can get involved as well and get yourself a light trap and start to record the moths in your garden, or even just do a walk around and record them in the National Moth Recording Scheme. And yeah, that's me done. And I will stop sharing my screen. That's all right.
Fantastic, Emelie. Thank you so much for that incredible insight into our nocturnal pollinators. So I should just quickly introduce myself as Mark, another one of the forum trustees, and I've been doing my best to collate the questions coming into the chat, Emelie, and there's more coming now as I speak. So I'm going to put a selection to you for the next sort of 15 minutes or so before we wrap up, if that's okay. And if you haven't had your question, I'll do my best. And if you haven't had your question answered, then yeah, well, Emelie shared her email address. Maybe she'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm going to start, I think, with some sort of general questions about moths that have come out. And I think the first one, I think it was from Dave, and he asked, what distance do moths typically fly to feed, if we know that at all?
Yeah, so it can vary massively, and I think it's quite correlated with their size. So quite small ones travel quite small distances. But one of the cool benefits about moths in terms of pollination is their pollen transfer distances, like hoverflies as well. So they're not short range travelers, and they can travel for, I think I'd say, like a guess. Well, it's not a guess, but they could be migratory, for example. They can cross water bodies, and I'd say they can go kilometers at a time. Strong-bodied moths. So yeah, I'd say quite more than you expect. Yeah,
which I suppose explains why you're maybe seeing those drivers happening at larger scales than the individual garden potentially.
Yeah. And yeah, so they have to forage for they're like their host plant, and then also the pollen nectar sources. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks, Emelie. So I had a few questions actually around macro moths and micro moths. So you mentioned, I think you showed a graph showing the decline of moths, and you mentioned, I think that was primarily at least coming from data on macro moths. So
yeah,
do we know anything about micro moths, sort of the status of micro moths? And also, did you actually look at micro moths in your research, or were you just focused on the larger macro moth species?
so the first part of the question, I think in terms of micro moths, they're much harder to monitor based on these kind of long-term data sets and citizens amateur science, because they are so hard to identify, a lot of them, especially in wild areas. And I'm not 100% sure about their state, but I would suggest that just pure habitat degradation is probably driving their overall population and abundance decline, but with nuances in there. And the second part of the question, I looked at micro moths in all of this research. And for example, because in urban systems, I mean, the diversity is big, but it's not that big because we've got this kind of filtering out of the species that can't survive there. But I found for the pollination networks, most micro moths didn't actually have pollen on them, so they need much less nectar to survive because they've got like such a tiny body, and so therefore they're probably less likely to be carrying pollen, is what I found.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you very much. Right, trying to get through these questions. So it's Alison asked a question, and this may be beyond the scope of your work, Emelie, but she was interested to know more about aquatic moths. I don't know if that's something you've come across at all in your work. I didn't even know this was a thing, but larvae that actually feed on aquatic plants. Is that something you've ever studied?
I've never studied that, but it doesn't surprise me because I mean, like all those life cycles that I showed are super general, and we know that. I mean, you've got different, we've got differences in so many different species. So I don't know anything about that. I'm sorry. And
no, it sounds like there's some more research needed there, Alison. But really interesting. So I'm looking at the questions coming in now. We've definitely had a couple around sort of what are the best plants for moths in your garden, and whether it's any sort of a plant, or particularly shrubs and trees, given you've talked about how important they are. So could you give us sort of a top 3, top 5 moth friendly plants?
So I'm a tiny bit hesitant to do that because it's the DNA barcoding was important to show differences between moths and bees, basically. Like there's no bias in that. But sometimes it can misidentify the plants that it's sequencing and give you only a genus level, for example. But I do know that Buddleia was the number one visited, or the number one most frequent moth visited plant in that analysis, and I'd be pretty confident with that one, which is
quite controversial.
Yeah, I mean, you see, I'm not like I know. Sorry, but I'm not an Asian biologist, but I'm going to stick to just like having a nice kind of wild patch in shrubs and trees. Yeah, and definitely more research needs to be done by that. And I'd love to do some sort of experiment where people plant wildflowers of different sorts and then monitor the moths and see if their community changes based on these kind of additions, which is what is needed, because that's what we have about bees. And I take back the Buddleia one.
Sounds good. We always say more research needed. Watch this space. Okay, related to this, actually, another question from Lou, and he was asking particularly, or it could be a she, sorry Lou, he or she, can mixed native hedging also play a role? How helpful could having sort of native hedging in your garden be?
Well, I'd say, I'd say pretty good.
Yeah.
It sounds, I think that's based on the kind of complexity of habitat is going to be that same kind of idea.
Yeah, no,
sorry, makes very informative.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Right, I'm getting through these now. So I think we've had a few queries as well coming in, just to ask you to reiterate about your methods, Emelie, in terms of specifically, first of all, did you, was all your moth trapping non-destructive? So were you able to identify everything in the field, or did you have to sort of lethally sample the moths? And then other people just again asking a little bit more about light trapping in the garden more generally, and can you recommend sort of how long you might have to leave a moth trap out and things like that. So yeah, a little bit about the light trapping method that you use, and then in general.
Okay, so for the Dublin stuff, I used the light traps and I didn't kill anything. I could identify everything either I took pictures of them and released them. And then the Sheffield stuff, I did euthanize them, and that was to extract the pollen off their proboscis. But these light traps are basically battery powered, and they're UV lights, which is like a very low light source. And they attract moths from a kind of short distance. I think the radius is about 10 meters. And this is quite nice because number one, you don't get a massive catch. And number two, you're basically like sampling moths in the kind of small habitat which you're interested in. And you just leave them on for one night, and then the battery runs out and the light turns off. And then you just look at them in your egg cartons and record them, and then just like put them into a bush. And then you do that. So I think the National Moth Recording Scheme, if you want to get involved, or in a garden moth scheme, they basically say you sample once a week during the summer, like one night a week, with a minimum of 3 days between the sample, to let the moths go back out again and not recapture the same ones. But I mean, there's loads of stuff on Butterfly Conservation website, and I'd recommend looking into it if you're interested in it, because it's a really cool data set and really cool monitoring scheme that's been going on since the 70s, I think. And it's getting more popular.
Right. No, that's really comprehensive. Thanks, Emelie. And we'll try and get a link to the National Moth Recording Scheme in the chat as well here while we're talking, if we can. Right, we're getting there. While we're talking about light traps, I've just got to ask this question, because I think there's still a little bit of mystery about this. Do we know actually why moths are attracted to light in the first place?
Well, I saw there was a preprint of a paper that did that, maybe answered it, but I didn't read it all. So, but like I think it's an orientation thing, right? I mean, I think that's the most logical hypothesis, that they basically orientate themselves around light, and then if it's the moon, then you can do it in a certain way. But if it's a artificial light, then it's confusing. But if they're not, like, I mean, some moths are obviously more able to get through the light pollution, because like moths are actually active in cities, and there's the same moths that would be attracted to light. So that's also really interesting, whether there's kind of some sort of plastic responses within moth species that some can basically learn not to be attracted to them, or just survive with the light.
No, very interesting. And I see we've had a paper link in the chat from Steve. So thanks, Steve. That can be some bedtime reading for me sometime. An ongoing challenge. Right. We'll give you a break soon, Emelie, but a few more questions. So,
okay.
I think there's a lot of interest in your this idea that you've got to have habitat complexity at this sort of neighbouring garden scale.
Yeah.
And it makes an awful lot of sense. But I guess thinking about how do we actually achieve that in practice? Have you got any examples where gardeners have sort of come together and worked together to try and achieve this sort of collective gardening approach, whether it's for moths or any other groups? Are there a way that we can incentivize this to encourage housing developers to put more trees and shrubs in, for example? I don't know, any ideas that you've got for how we can achieve that sort of neighborhood scale garden habitat in practice?
It's really complicated, right? And like difficult to do. And I think in that paper, the Dublin stuff and the neighboring gardening stuff, it was for, like, we had some landscape advice, and just the advice to basically configure gardens when developing so they can create a bigger patch rather than isolated patches throughout a residential area, if that's possible. But I've seen it quite well done in allotments, and I know they're different to domestic gardens, but like individual plot owners kind of like can see by their securities and this kind of top secretaries, like kind of bring down this kind of top down approach within an allotment site, for example, is quite nice to see. And I've definitely seen that in the field, and like when people are planting more plants out there for pollinators, your neighbour is more likely to do it. But in terms of domestic gardens, I don't know, it's so tricky, because I mean, there's such a public perception of just needing a neat lawn all the time.
Mm. Yeah, no,
So
it's good.
yeah.
And if anyone was here for our talk earlier in February, we were talking about sort of meadows in gardens. Adrian Thomas gave us a great talk about that. So yeah, it's good to see campaigns like No Mow May and other movements like this, initiatives to try and think about increasing habitat complexity within gardens as well. So yeah, that's good. Okay, I think maybe one last question, Emelie, and we'll look. I think you're 2 hours ahead as well, aren't you, of us in Helsinki? So we need to let you get.
Oh no, I'm in Sheffield right now.
So you're in Sheffield today? Okay, that's all right.
I haven't eaten my dinner yet.
Oh, so we've definitely had better let you go soon. Yeah, last question. So you talked about this idea of gardens, neighborhood scale habitat being important, but where you did have a garden with sort of high amounts of sort of tree or shrub cover, was there abundance of moths any greater within those gardens, even if the species richness wasn't higher? So I suppose no. Okay, interesting.
No, but the thing is, though, so those light traps are probably attracting moths from further out of the garden potentially as well. So you're also, I mean, there's a slight there's a slight kind of methodological potential artifact in that, but it's also, I would never discourage someone from creating their garden or like lose hope that it's not going to make any difference.
Yeah.
Because as I said, like it's a sample, like it's for all this research is like the beginning of this kind of like research topic and the first kind of evidence and this relatively small number of sites and repetition, if you think about it. So all of this just kind of take in general and don't take it like I'm going to cut down all my hedges because it's going to be useless kind of thing. But it's just a good start, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree that everything that we can do in the garden can make a difference, and it soon starts to scale up when we're collaborating with our neighbours as well. Fantastic. Look, Emelie, we better let you go and get your dinner, and maybe there's a few other people who haven't had their dinner either. So look, thank you so much again for your time. Absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else listening has as well. We can't give you a round of applause because everyone's on mute, but imagine it's happening virtually.
Well, thanks everyone for listening.
We've got a few hand claps